Hey, Casella here. Before we get going, two quick things. First, A Meal of Thorns is a critical book club, and we try to make them accessible and interesting even if you haven't read the book, which is not to say we avoid spoilers. Just wanted to note that. Second, you may notice that A Meal of Thorns and our home at the Ancillary Review of Books do not have ads. Every time I think about going that route, some website or podcast that I like has some ethically horrific advert smack in the middle, and I recommit to staying ad-free. But we'd like to get the podcast and the ARB sustainable, and would really appreciate your support. Joining our Patreon would be very cool of you, and you can also buy books through our bookshop. Okay, on to the show. A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Welcome to Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ancillary Review of Books. I'm Jake Casella-Brookins. Today we're talking about Victor LaValle's 2016 novella, The Ballad of Black Tom. I'm joined by Garrett Bridger Gilmore. Garrett, hello.
Hello. Well, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Garrett teaches literature in Alabama. He's published work on the legacy of slavery, abolitionism and Reconstruction in American culture, Southern literature, and 20th century liberalism. He's got work appearing in Mississippi Quarterly, Modern Fiction Studies, Faulkner Journal, and more. He also teaches and writes on African American literature, literary theory, and race and identity in horror, weird fiction, and science fiction. Perfectly lining you up to talk about what we're talking about today. So today we're going to talk about The Ballad of Black Tom, which is a novella by Victor LaValle. It's a retelling, if that's the right word, of H.P. Lovecraft's short story, The Horror at Red Hook, which was first published in 1927. The Ballad of Black Tom has two parts. In the first, we get the story of Charles Thomas Tester, aka Black Tom, who's a hustler and mediocre guitar player in Harlem, who becomes entangled in supernatural goings-on. In the second section, through the eyes of a Detective Malone, who Black Tom had run into earlier, we learn a little bit more about the terrifying forces that Black Tom has become involved with and the powers he has gained. It was published by Tor.com in 2016. It was an early part of the novella resurgence. I think Tor.com's novella line had started, I want to say, the year before, but there had only been a few. And The Ballad of Black Tom won the Shirley Jackson Award. It was nominated for basically every relevant award out there. And in 2022, it was reissued in a nice hardcover edition. So if you're looking for it, it's out there once again. So Garrett, I want you to tell me kind of like what's your relationship either with this story in particular or Victor LaValle more broadly, kind of like why this was of interest to you when we were talking about titles to pick.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that this was the first thing by him that I'd read. I got it. I mean, I think it was shortly after it came out, or actually must have been a little bit later because it was after I moved to Alabama, which was in 2018. There had been several things that had kind of crossed into the mainstream that were these sort of adaptations or engagements with Lovecraft, and I'd read several of them before. So, I mean, I think that I read like Lovecraft Country, like when that came out, because that was sort of inescapable.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had read Paul Lafarge's The Night Ocean. And then this was just kind of also there in the library. I saw it on the shelf, picked it up. And I honestly didn't think too much about it initially. Rereading it for this, I've found it much more memorable, interesting. Yeah, I honestly don't think I thought much about it after I read it. And then I read The Lone Women, which I guess came out a couple of years ago, which is itself kind of Lovecrafty. I mean, I think some people talk about that being a sort of take on the Dunwich horror,
Yeah.
the sort of like monstrous sibling situation. But yeah, this is something that I've been thinking about in terms of my broader research. My kind of research is into literary depictions of engagement with the past. I'm interested in kind of different questions of the way that science and kind of scientific and pseudoscientific discourse has shaped ideas about race and identity, and power and politics, things like that. So it's in a zone for me, kind of academically, much more than I've thought about it as something that I read for pleasure, I guess. It's sort of returned at the level of ideas for me.
Cool.
For the most part, yeah.
No, that's great. That Lone Women connection is interesting. So if listeners don't know, that's LaValle's, I believe, most recent novel, and it's
I think so.
It's a Western, kind of like a homestead act story about a black woman who tries to go homesteading, and supernatural stuff happens there too. It's funny. I hadn't I like everything of Laval's that I've read. I hadn't really put Black Tom alongside Lone Women in my head until you brought it up. And it's just kind of interesting because Lone Women has some similar vibe. Not, I don't want to use vibes for every single thing out there. It has similar elements of sort of supernatural power being used for bloody vengeance, right? Kind of retribution. But it also leans a little more into, there's kind of a glimmer of a utopian reading in Lone Women, right? With like
Yes.
these
It's much more hopeful.
yeah. The like very like last couple chapters of that you could almost imagine an analogous last couple bits like that here in Black Tom. But we'll get to how
We'll
Black
get
Tom
there. Yeah.
yeah, that's cool. I'd read this for a book club back when it came out and liked it. And I think like you coming back to it, I was struck a lot more by how it resonated with me because I think this is one of the dangers of adaptation and retellings is that depending on how you come at them the first time, that's kind of the main way you approach it. Is just what is this doing like qua retelling? And not so much how it kind of stands on its own. And this coming back to this time, I was a lot more struck by just like individual lines and like kind of how well crafted this
Mhm.
is as a story. I did go back and read The Horror at Red Hook, which I hadn't read in a very long time. And it's funny, like, so I was gearing myself up for like this mini little Lovecraft spiel because I think we are going to talk about Lovecraft at least a little bit here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was kind of gearing myself up for this spiel of like, we get it, he's a racist. Let's talk about other stuff going on. And then I read The Horror Red Hook. I'm like, no, we have to talk again about how racist he is. Like, you just
Yeah.
can't move past it.
Well, I was going to say, like, that's the most like in your face, like the slurs, the sort of overt like dehumanization of the various immigrant groups
Mm-hmm.
in question in the story. It's also like not a good story. I mean,
Yeah.
it's confusing. It's kind of
Mm-hmm.
boring.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to track like what's happening at any given moment,
Mm-hmm.
but not in like an interesting or
Nope.
challenging way.
Uh-huh.
And I was kind of researching it to be able to talk about it, and he apparently tried to sell it as a detective story first, and then had to kind of
Oh,
like
like,
he was trying to get out of the sort of like horror space.
yeah. Oh, so like into like detective pulps or something like that, or
Yeah,
oh, huh.
and they were like, this is terrible. So then he had to like retrofit it back into being this kind of supernatural mystery. So it's a mess,
Huh.
like structural, it's a mess of a text, and then it's also just like abysmal.
Mm-hmm.
The overt sort of disdain
Yeah.
is
Well,
remarkable.
I mean, like, so you have this fact in your head that like, right, like Lovecraft is a racist. Like everyone talks about it. Like we all kind of know that. But then reading that story now, today, in 2024, I think much like reading Ballad of Black Tom, like early in the Trump presidency, it was just this feeling of just like, oh, like we are still fighting this thing, right? Like it's a story about, demonizing immigrants and like longing for
Yeah.
mass deportation. And it's yeah, it's brutal.
Yeah, it's also a lot about underground tunnels, which
Oddly.
Lovecraft is really, really into like tunnels under houses. It's a really
Hmm.
big thing for him. And I
Yeah.
don't, there's like a Freudian way to get into that probably, but
Wet tunnels. Yeah, right. Yeah. So this the Ballad of Black Tom is dedicated to Lovecraft. With all my conflicted feelings, Lavelle writes. And yeah, I guess maybe we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but we'd wanted to talk a little bit about this kind of you'd been calling it a boomlet, which I really like, of Lovecraft retellings and re-engagings. But just thinking about the way that despite all of the negative things we think about Lovecraft, and I do think there are worthwhile things to talk about him stylistically, even though like often it goes so far that it's easy to kind of make fun of. But obviously there's a lot thematically that still resonates in some way, whether that's inspired by or inspired to, sort of take up and challenge. But yeah, so what do you think about Battle of Black Tom as like an example of this thing going on, and like what else do you want to connect this to?
yeah, I mean, so the thing that struck me in like researching this was that Battle Black Tom and Lovecraft Country came out on the same day.
Oh, wow.
So like the exact like February 16th, 2016. So
Hmm.
it's almost impossible to think about them like not together. And so it's interesting, right? Because like Lovecraft Country gets adapted by
Hmm.
HBO, right? Like that one has like a much bigger kind of media life than Ballad of Black Tom does. I think that Ballad of Black Tom probably responds to the politics of the moment a little more
Mm.
closely,
Hmm.
and I'm sure there's lots of reasons for that. But I think that, right, Lovecraft's his work had been kind of taken up probably since like the 90s, right? By people interested, like scholars, like theorists doing kind of like eco-critical stuff, like post-human
Hmm.
theory type stuff, right? And so all of the stuff that like presents horror to Lovecraft's narrators, right? All of the scholars who are like researching their weird stuff. Right, that's kind of like valorized, right? In the sense of like the indifference of nature, I think is like kind of like liberating to a lot of theorists, kind of academics, right? There's this kind of like desire in certain like intellectual academic spaces to kind of recover something, right? Like this
Hmm.
failure of kind of like hyper rationalistic modern knowledge, right? Lovecraft like brings us to like the edge of what's knowable. And then there's like this embrace of what's like unknowable and like the sort of porousness of bodies and all of that stuff.
Hmm.
So I think there's like one of the ways we could think about the boomlet, this kind of like race specific boomlet, right? Or one that's interested in kind of using the material of Lovecraft narrative, but then also like Lovecraft as a kind of cultural figure. There's a way I think of pushing back within specific to that sort of like intellectual discourse. And that's something that hopefully we can talk more about here, like the implication that Tom like starts global warming,
Uh-huh.
right, is to me fascinating.
Hmm.
A detail that does not need to be in the
Yeah.
novella at all, but
Hmm.
is very evidently there. So there's I think a little bit of pushback on that kind of like post-humanist idea, right? That somehow like if we can imagine human existence or subjectivity beyond our social structures, then we're kind of liberated in certain ways. There's also been a lot of like Black feminists theorizing about that kind of also in this era, like flagging the ways that like a lot of these kind of grand theories of post-humanity or whatever are kind of reinscribing race in certain ways.
Uh-huh.
That they attempt to kind of move beyond race, but they end up like falling back and normalizing certain kinds of like stereotypes or like narrative patterns
Mm.
that historically are used to sort of denigrate, dehumanize, or like associate, especially like Black women with like nature and irrationality and all these things. So
Mm.
there's a kind of there is a kind of Black critical pushback to some of that post-human stuff. I also would, I mean, I am kind of like interested in like Freud. Like, so I'm always like sort of thinking like psychologically. I think that there's something about like the Obama presidency also, right? That kind of
Mm.
dredges up this sense that like there was a moment where we like sort of achieved something and then immediately there's like the backlash to it.
Uh-huh.
And so I think that using this figure of like obvious backlash, like obvious kind of like racial horror in the sense of, right? I mean, Lovecraft is like so much about the sort of disappointed white eliteness,
Right.
right? And it's kind of like psychic power. I think there's something interesting to kind of mind that or think about that critically, engaging from a kind of anti-racist perspective. So I think that probably those would be the two things that I would sort of take to making sense of why Lovecraft at this moment. I would imagine also there might be an argument that like his works start to come into the public domain at this time,
Oh, right. Yeah,
like
that
his
would
early
track.
works. So they might. I don't. That would be. I mean, that's a kind of question of literary sociology that I'm not equipped to answer here. But there might be something with some kind of like publishing institutional interest in doing something with these properties that are now probably increasingly. I don't know who
Yeah,
owns the rights to them, but there might be something with that as well.
that's
That's
interesting.
speculative. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder like so the idea of various kinds of post-human scholars, ecological scholars, and I should say like writers as well, right? Like fiction writers
Yeah.
who are interested in these themes, like picking up on Lovecraft's mythos, as kind of a way to think about those. That does make sense. But that also makes sense, right? If you're reaching for this as kind of a model, it maybe shouldn't be a shock to us that the world erasing apocalypse that is dreamed of in so many different ways somehow didn't wipe out race and racism, right? And when you go back to the
Right.
source material, that's really in your face.
Yeah.
Huh. That's interesting just because I've like so I was as I was doing this, I was specifically thinking about, obviously Lovecraft Country, some of the other works you mentioned, but I was thinking about the way that Lovecraft is also a not always overt, but very frequently present ingredient in the new weird,
Hmm.
right in the background of that. It's, there's nothing that you can explicitly point to in, say, like Vandermeer's Southern Reach, and say like this is Lovecraft, but you can also like it's also very easy to sort of put something like Annihilation right next to
Yeah,
Lovecraft's work and be like, okay, there's a lineage here of deranging horrors from beyond and tentacles and mushy stuff. And it's a different kind of working with it, but
yeah,
that's interesting.
yeah. And there's also, I mean, there's also a kind of broader mainstreaming, I guess, of like specifically like African American narratives in like mainstream like science fiction, fantasy narratives, right? So
Mm-hmm.
like, and also in like literary, sort of like high literature stuff, because Underground Railroad also comes out in 2016.
Oh yeah, uh-huh.
Get Out is February 2017. Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing Black Panther starting in
Mm-hmm.
2016.
Okay.
He
Hmm.
writes he follows up Between the World and Me with a work of speculative fiction
Right, yeah.
in 2019, like Black Panther's 2018. So there's there's something happening culturally where one of the ways that like Black representation, but also like Black like creative production is able to find mass audiences is through genre, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
through speculative genres. And so it's interesting to me, right, to kind of have the prominent versions of that are kind of after this. They're after 2016, they're after these two, they're after Black Tom comes out, they're after Lovecraft Country comes out. But it really is one of the more sort of like prominent venues or kind of like media, right, like spheres for yeah, for like Black film and television,
Mm-hmm.
finding like popular audiences, but then also like critical success. So
Yeah.
there's something like beyond just the genre space of it. And there's something just beyond the even the sort of like explicit political interest that people might have, right? And kind of doing this like anti-racist retelling.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a way that it kind of goes mainstream that I'd be interested in thinking more about.
Yeah. Something about like using these speculative and like sometimes, specifically Lovecraft notions of apocalypse and I guess of maybe of evil and something about the idea of like ancient evil specifically and these sort of like things recurring and like revisiting them. One of the things I was thinking about while rereading this, because this is a very confident little novella, right? Like it really feels like it knows what it's doing. And it's not like Laval rarely he rarely strikes me as a flashy writer, right? Like there's not a lot of this. It's like designed to jump out at you. It's I don't want to use like transparent prose because that's kind of I don't really like that term, but it just kind of flows along pretty seamlessly. But then the points that do jump out that are a little more like stylistically, a little more flourishes really jump out, and there are a bunch of those in here. There's when Malone, who's the detective, confronts Black Tom, or is confronted by Black Tom towards the very end in the kind of like basement scene where everything's going down. Black Tom has that little speech, says, "I bear a hell within me, and finding myself unsympathized with, wish to tear up the trees, spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin." And like that's a good line.
Yeah,
That's nice. Connecting that and sort of what the book is doing with Black Tom's anger and power at the end, to me was really resonating with a lot of speculative fiction beyond the Lovecraft specific things, but it's making me think about how maybe there's been a shift in thinking about violence as potentially justified and just finding ways of expressing anger about the state of the world and specifically race issues but also classism and the degradation of the environment. I was actually thinking quite a bit about Jemison's fifth season, and those books and this, which is also like that's around the same time period, right, kind of coming out. And I don't think
yeah, I think
those
like
are,
2015.
I think 20, yeah, 15, 16, 17, something like that.
Yeah,
Which are, are not, those are not Lovecraftian, but those are about, right, like sort of like repressed societal evil kind of like colliding in weird ways with like ancient forces coming up from below, envisioning destruction as at least a kind of like justified retaliatory act, if, questionable whether or not, in those books, if it's how like liberatory or just it is, right? But this idea that like taking these ancient powers that are connected to something really gnarly and using that back against the oppressors, that really, I don't know, really works. And I think that's one of the reasons those books did so well because they're capturing that so well.
Yeah, and there's an interesting way too that like these, I mean these are all, I mean to periodize in a kind of vulgar way, right?
Hmm.
They're all they're all kind of like post Trayvon Martin, right?
Yeah.
But they're
Uh-huh.
but they're pre George Floyd, right?
Mm.
So there's a way that like the kind of political demand, right? Especially like relating to race in the United States, is being articulated. It's not it hasn't quite found the form that it would end up taking, right?
Mm.
And then I
Hmm.
think we can understand some of the co-optation and the sort of state capture of the 2020 protest movements.
Hmm.
That's some of that gets channeled into the funding for for like Black
Right.
speculative
Yeah.
film and television.
Hmm.
There is something powerful about the kind of representational capacity, right? Like not being responsible to articulating like a clear politics, right? Or a clear like world after, right? The kind of like clearing away gesture, right? Or kind of radical rupture. There's something kind of powerful that about that, especially like before all of that anger does end up getting kind of co-opted and like turned back into kind of the system as normal.
Hmm.
But I also think that there's the thing that I like about this book is that you or this novella is you do see the kind of present politics in more explicit ways. I mean, the end of the novella when they are the police like pull out their machine guns, they're like anti-aircraft machine guns, right? They're
Yeah.
just like highly militarized and
Hmm.
bulldoze three apartment buildings just by like shooting them with anti-aircraft guns. Like
Yeah.
there's something really powerful about that. It's like an absurd scene in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
It's kind of anachronistic, right? I mean, I would assume that the NYPD didn't have anti-aircraft weaponry
Hmm. I hope.
in the
I
I
would
don't
not
know.
be
They may
I would
did.
not be shocked to learn they did,
No,
but I don't think they did. I hope they did.
I don't think they did.
It would not shock me to find out that the New York Police Department today has anti-aircraft guns, right? Like that would just be like
I'm
par
sure
for
they
the
do.
course, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure they have like, yeah. But so there's right, there's ways that I mean, to get this back to this kind of genre question, right? The retelling as a specific kind of social intervention versus like imagining like a totally, different kind of speculative world.
Mm.
I think it requires like different, like we have to think about it differently. We have to think about the historical inheritance. I mean, like there's an argument being made about, right, that like we've inherited this specific world, right?
Hmm.
And Tom's he's escaped it in a way, right? I mean, like he's escaped the history that we live in.
Hmm.
If we think about this as a kind of historical narrative that actually kind of like leads up to our present, which
Hmm.
there's implications, right? The sort of climate change implication at the end of it
Hmm.
kind of points to that. I mean, I feel like the Broken Earth, like that's also interested in kind of like rebuilding a life after, right? I mean,
Yeah. I mean, it starts with the end of the world. Yeah.
right. And so the thing that I think I didn't like about this the first time, but that I'm kind of reconsidering now that I'm thinking about it again, was Tommy's like escape, right? Like into this kind of like other dimension, like with the Sleeping King or whatever.
Hmm.
And like whether or not that felt like a kind of out, right? I mean, like
Mm.
it works like he gets relief from the things that he's harmed by, right?
Hmm.
And his life has fallen apart, right? He has no family anymore. He realizes that he's kind of alienated from the community that he lives in. So he chooses something else. I think that the way that that's sort of paid off, it feels more justified to me reading it now, and I don't know if that's an artifact of me having read this in like 2017 versus reading it again now.
Hmm.
I don't know if that's a result of just paying attention to different parts of it. But what I think at first to me felt like a way of just kind of ending it, like avoiding a kind of politics, right? That because
Hmm.
this is one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot, like with his sort of speculative historical fiction, right? I don't know if that's like a specific genre, but you
Hmm.
know what I mean? Like something
Yeah.
that is
Right.
speculative, but it's
Right.
like set in the past, but not in a kind of like, like steampunk, like ambiguous past, but like an actual kind
Hmm.
of historical past. I always feel like the implication is that like we still end up with the world that we live in today. And so
Yeah.
there's a
Right.
question of like who is the speculative elements, like showing us something about power or showing us something about society or whatever, does that get us something different now? Like is there like a through
Uh-huh.
line to the
Uh-huh.
present that sort of pays off in the way that like imagining a future, like if I have something set in the future or something set in the present that sort of like leads to a kind of speculative future, there's like a sort of positive forward vision for that often, even if it's ambivalent. It doesn't have to be
Hmm.
utopian, but it offers some kind of other structure.
Right.
And here it's like
Hmm.
it's just this like refusal of structure, which is also cool. I mean, I think it's interesting.
Hmm.
I think now I find it more interesting than I did before, but it definitely is doing a kind of narrative move that I think a lot of other works that are set in a past but are speculative that they do, right? Because like the characters get this other thing, but we've like
Right.
lost access to it somehow, right? And that's the end of
Hmm.
Lone Women as well, right? I mean, like they
Hmm.
form this new community, but then the narrator at the end is like, well, it's not on any map and we can't find it, but like maybe if you're lucky, you can
Right.
access it. So there's a kind
Hmm.
of ambivalence about the kind of imaginative work that's gone into making the politics visible that I find
Hmm.
interesting. I mean, I can't resolve it obviously, but I like that to me is like where
Yeah.
the thorniness is, I guess, right? Is
Hmm.
we can handle the past by using these kind of genre elements to make things to emphasize things to make things clear. But if we can't like if we don't have the Sleeping King's magic, then like
Hmm.
what does it do for us?
Yeah, that's interesting. Something I'm perpetually kind of fascinated in is modern works that would seem to be speculative, but somehow contain that in a way that makes them palatable to a non-speculative audience. I'm specifically thinking here about thrillers. Every Michael Crichton book has every element you would think you would need to call it science fiction, but all of them deploy some kind of strategy to kind of contain it so that they don't imply that there's a different future after the end of that novel than the one we're living in today. So it allows someone to read it in a way that's not challenging politically, right? Like
Right.
if at the end of Jurassic Park they were actually like out running around free, okay, that's a different world where they're dinosaurs, right? And you can't have that. So you have to have a way that you can kind of like mostly contain it. And I just think that's really interesting because for me, I'm perpetually fascinated by genre definitions. I think it's really interesting. I mean, it's also kind of, it's a little skeptic maybe, it doesn't really go anywhere super useful all the time, but I just think what how writers are engaging with at least a hypothetical reading audience and how that reading audience is receiving it is interesting. And for me, one of the key things about science fiction specifically is the notion of change. And it's the literature that can help us both express and think about current and future changes. I had never really thought about that with the specifically historical slash speculative when they are avoiding an alternate history, right? Because that part of what this is doing is it's not setting up a timeline where you know, Cthulhu rose in the Hudson, and then there's, an alternate 20th century after that. That's not what this book is setting up. Huh, that's strange. I don't know
Yeah.
what to make of that.
Yeah, I mean, so like, well, I was going to say, like, I just finished teaching Kindred in this class that I'm teaching
Mm.
on, it's on like African American, like historical fiction. So history that engages, or fiction that engages history.
Hmm.
And like that novel ends, like, we know what happened. Like, it starts with her coming back from the past the last time. And it ends
Right.
with Dana and Kevin, the two, Dana, the protagonist, and her husband. They are like, well, at least we know that happened, right? And my students were
Hmm.
what do you do with this, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a way that I mean I think that's a product in some ways of like when it was written, right? That
Hmm.
there's kind of debates about the experiences of enslaved people going on culturally. Then it's also the late 70s, so the bicentennials just happened. But
Hmm.
my student like that lack of closure was like very off-putting
Mm.
to my students because they expected it to kind of like lead to some kind of insight.
Uh-huh.
And then we had this kind of conversation. They were like, I thought this was science fiction, like there was no science in it. So then we kind of
Hmm.
talked about like, well, it's actually kind of like historical fantasy, but it's also set in the present. So like the questions of like history and genre stuff, like that's I mean, I guess I'm like, increasingly interested
Hmm.
in sort of trying to mine those things. And one of the things I've been thinking about too is there's been all this work recently on the rise of just historical fiction generally, right?
Mm.
As the kind of as a popular form of fiction, or it's books that people buy, but it's also like what wins awards.
Hmm.
Um, so there's an interesting way that this kind of historical speculative stuff is kind of sitting in the middle of these emerging questions of taste, along with these emerging questions of like, well, actually, how do we re-narrate our nation's history, or like how do we re-narrate the histories of gender or of
Yeah.
race, where like setting something in the past is a way of kind of buying it relevance, right? This is one of the
Hmm.
kind of arguments that people make, right? That you one of the crises of kind of the contemporary literary market is that like there's so much, there's a glut of options. No one has any sort of set tastes. We don't really have like reliable taste-making institutions at a mass level.
Hmm.
And so people write historical novels because like I know World War II was important, so like this novel must
Right.
have been important, right?
Yep.
So then thinking about like the choice of like what historical setting to narrate something in, I think like that helps me like kind of think about what like this book is doing.
Hmm.
And I think that actually is part of why I found it much more interesting the second time is because
Mm.
I've since I read it the first time, I've taught Harlem Renaissance literature a bunch in my job, right?
Mm.
And reading Lavelle interviews about this book, he talks about kind of being ambivalent about the kind of politics of representation, and he talks about basically his first collection of stories was this kind of like gritty urban realism that he like later felt sort of embarrassed about,
Mm.
right? That it was too. I'll see if I can find the quote, but if he said it's called Slapboxing with Jesus, and the general description might be gritty stories about Black and Latino boys growing up in New York City. And the fact that I could even sum it up that way might tell you some degree of what the book is like.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
so he's also someone that moves from right something that's much more kind of like presentist, but also maybe in a way that he feels is like kind of like vulgar or is not actually kind of there's like a way that that representation is commodified.
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
he talks about Tom being a hustler, someone who like pretends to play blues
Hmm.
as being like a really important kind of thematic like kernel of this.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
that it's actually about engaging in a kind of like race hustle essentially,
Hmm.
and then kind of like getting in over your head about it with a kind of like white appreciation,
Hmm.
and then like reaching for something else, right? I mean, you could make a very kind of like crassly like biographical reading of the novel that like that's Laval's
Hmm.
trajectory, right? That the move into this like
Hmm.
sort of like
Hmm.
alternative space is this move to a kind of like fictional genre
Hmm.
world. But I don't know
Hmm.
if that got your question. Your question about change. Like there's a question about. I think that this book is interesting because it denies a kind of origin because Tom is so alienated from everything around him, even in this moment, which is the height of a certain kind of representational politics of racial authenticity and of the beginning of kind of mass commodification of Black culture and art
Hmm.
through like jazz and kind of primitivist art and things like that. To have this character like already be alienated from that, like already be sort of cynically performing it. That's what really made this turn for me as like, okay, there's something like really cool happening here
Yeah.
beyond just kind of like revising Lovecraft, right? It's there's something much more about it opens up in sort of like broader representational questions.
Hmm. Oh, that's super interesting. I have like too many thoughts here. One was I just saw Percival Everett was talking here and about very similar things, how he was thinking through James and like this desire to like re-engage with what the literature of what race looks like in America, like kind of like from the inside and the outside at the same time, and trying to think about that divide. I don't know where to go with that. It just kind of rhymes.
Yeah, and James like also ends with Jim like embracing violence, right? Like
Hmm.
there's the kind of like radical refusal to participate that's very similar to this. And that's an interesting kind of like disavowal of accepting the terms of the author that you're adapting, I
Right.
think.
Hmm.
The sort of ambivalent relationship, but then totally refusing the terms of the value system at the end
Hmm.
feels necessary. It feels necessary, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think thinking about Black Tom's specific arc here,
Yeah.
novella
Yeah,
just,
we should talk about the book more.
yeah, right. Well, just, the novella ending with him just kind of like jumping out a window and vanishing. Thinking about that alongside Kindred, where part of why part of why Kindred is so potent, and I think this is Butler generally, is Butler just not giving you answers, right? Not giving you a reading key and not giving you little solutions to let you tie it up. That you just have to kind of sit with it. There's not
Right.
like you can't like boil it down to a moral or a parable or something, but that makes the reality of it that much more in your face, like it because you can't just kind of like tie it up and like shove it back in your mind, like, okay, that's how that worked. Which I mean, in a strange way, maybe goes along with this kind of non-human radical dissentering kind of thing that people are pulling on Lovecraft and others to kind of get back to, and this like right this refusal to kind of like use reason to tidy everything up and draw a circle around everything, and then you can forget it.
Yeah. Well, there's a way too that I don't know, what would be the right way to put this? There's something with the like I want to call it like co-optation or something.
Mm,
So what you were just saying about Butler, right, is the kind of refusal of like pat answers, right, or of morality, or even of like characters who I feel like all of her characters give in to the kind of seductions that are offered to
mm,
them, right, in
mm-hmm,
ways that are kind of like understandable, but also that like push I reading sometimes push back against, like my students push back against.
mm-hmm,
There's a sense, right, that like there's two kinds of ways maybe that we can like engage. Well, there's probably more than two, but there's multiple ways we can engage with history, right? And think about like history as determinative of our present,
mm-hmm,
right? We have our kind of like dominant narratives of like American progress and all of that stuff, right? And there's a kind of way that we can see a lot of historical fiction and also speculative fiction pushing back against that, because then you can kind of show, right, the violences that have been hidden, right,
mm-hmm,
the pain that's been hidden, the stuff that's
right.
been forgotten and erased. I think there's also, though, right, this kind of way that culturally, even those critical discourses like they like have to be incorporated somehow like into the narrative, into the kind of national narrative, or the sort of
Mm,
whatever dominant narrative is there, so that there's like a way of telling a kind of speculative story about the past that would say that like, oh, like this group of people like had this hidden power then, right? And
mm-hmm,
were able to kind of resist like due to this kind of hidden power.
mm-hmm,
Um, and that sort of hiddenness is like actually like transmitted through history in a way that does actually kind of pay off as agency in the
mm,
present.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Okay.
right. Or that like understanding it, we like have access to something that's like restorative or is generative or is healing.
Mm-hmm,
And then there's a way of thinking about history, but then also this kind of speculative stuff, which is like, well, it's not real, right? Like we actually don't have access to the past. We can't understand how people lived in different, in like substantially different cultural settings, right? If we believe that material forces structure our subjectivity, or like structure the way we think and feel and understand the world, then we can't actually imagine what like a monk's life was like in the 1300s or something.
okay.
That's been a pretty fraught conversation in like African American literary spaces,
Yeah.
where there's this woman, Ida Levy Husson, who I think she teaches at Wisconsin or Michigan. I think she may be at Michigan, but she has this book. It's a very good book. It's called How to Read African American Literature. But she says basically that like there's two kind of dominant modes of reading this kind of African American historical work, and the first is the, I think she called it reparative. But basically, right, people come in wanting to have a vision of freedom and agency. There are these two basically sort of, I guess you would call them kind of like naive presuppositions that people take into reading this stuff, right? That one is that either this historical fiction is going to be offering something transformative through depicting a way of life that can be recovered, or that like the experience of the vicarious experience of like pain and suffering is going to be politically or socially or morally transforming for
Okay.
readers in the present. And then there's this other version that she calls prohibitive reading,
Mm,
where basically the idea is that like the life forms were sufficiently different that like something happening in the time of slavery doesn't map on to modern subjectivity in close enough ways for it to be like useful, or to
hmm,
to be anything other than fantasy, even if it's not
hmm.
like a speculative
Uh-huh.
narrative. Like the historical projection is itself a kind of fantasy that's dismissible, because it's not like, basically because it's not like rigorously Marxist. It's like, I mean, this is the kind of like
Okay. Hmm.
the Marxist. But her argument is that like actually all of these historical novel, or this historical fiction, it dramatizes the desire for a connection to the past, right?
Okay.
And dramatizes the limitations on achieving satisfaction of that desire. And I think that that's going on in the Ballad of Black Tom in a way that I find to be kind of useful because he has this connection, right, to the sort of supernatural forces that are there. He also has this like song that he gets taught by his father, right, which is
Hmm.
supposed to be a kind of like ward, right, a kind of protective.
Yeah, conjure song, right?
Yeah, that I think he gets from his mother, right?
Hmm.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
So he has this kind of like cultural thing that's like supposed to protect him, but the thing that actually kind of ends up paying off is the knife that his father gives him,
Hmm.
right? So there's this really interesting kind of skepticism of that kind of like cultural grounding.
Yeah.
So when I talk about like Tommy being like alienated in this, right? He's like when he goes to the like West Indian club, so he goes to this like social club, right, where all of the immigrants from the Caribbean like kind of meet. And he expects it to be this, right, this sort of like
Yeah.
horrific den of thieves.
Hmm.
So then he like confronts his own, right, his own kind of nativism
Hmm.
there. And it's like, oh, like this is fine, right? Like my
Hmm.
friend who runs it is a criminal, but like all of these are just like normal guys out having dinner.
Hmm.
Um, there's not really this kind of like redemptive, magical fantasy or scientific power that Tommy has access to,
Hmm.
right? He kind of gets it as a side effect of the collapse of the white regime, right? That he kind of sets off.
Right.
Um, and so that to me is like it's a different kind of imagining of like what agency comes from, I
Hmm.
guess, right? That it's actually like sort of like pulled out of the failure of a system rather than the sort of positive presence of like another cosmology or another like religious or
Hmm.
cultural system
Hmm.
that I think sometimes like authors like deal with in ways that I find tr like I have trouble kind of making sense of them.
Yeah.
Um, where like something that's religious or is cultural is like written into a narrative like as fantasy, right? Or like
Hmm.
as
Yeah.
and like even like Toni Morrison, right? People like ask, after Beloved, people are like asking her all the time, like, is this magical realism, right? Like they want to sort of consign it to or confine it to a sort of genre space as a way of like containing what
Hmm.
it's doing, and she refused that
Right.
constantly. But there's a way that like the real kind of mapping of cultural resistance, right? Or
Hmm.
like or not even resistance, but like sort of like cultural forms that were destroyed by slavery or by Jim Crow or whatever, right?
Hmm.
The way that those get sort of survived into these speculative things,
Hmm.
like it kind of makes me wonder about like the limits of speculative narrative to sort of do that work. Maybe that's the best way of putting it, right? That there's a way that you have to sort of like accept a provisional existence for it, like even though the author or the text like finds it to be of like crucial importance.
Hmm.
And I have trouble kind of managing like how do you navigate that kind of difference in scale
Right.
or whatever it
Well,
is.
if you have, so let's just use the historical speculative, right, as a form. If you within your speculative historical, you attribute magical powers of some kind in the past to a group, I think, maybe you kind of run the risk of in the current moment reading that in the present, you can only kind of read that as like this tidy, contained parable for some kind of power. It can't be anything else, right? Because otherwise, where is the alternate present? Where are those powers today, right? It can only be as a
Right,
sort of like metaphorical reading,
right,
which is like kind of fine, but kind of thin in some ways too.
right,
Yeah.
right. And
Hmm.
and I think that I think probably this is a problem that's created by having like sort of unfair expectations for like literary
Yeah.
representation.
Right.
But that's also like a kind of problem of like racial politics in the US generally is that the literary production of like minority writers like has to do a lot of representational work and a lot of political
Mm.
work that's like
Hmm.
not asked of like white writers.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so like part of the problem even of this conversation is like expecting it to sort of resolve things in a certain
Hmm.
way.
Yeah.
I can think of like other works from this time that do it differently. Like Ta-Nehisi Coates' novel. I don't know if you've read that.
Is that the water
Um,
dancer?
yeah,
Yeah, I haven't read that. Yeah.
it like could be just a sort of straight ahead historical novel, and then 2/3 of the way through, the main character realizes he has this like power. It doesn't
Mm.
really change anything. He uses it to like help other enslaved people escape slavery, but it it feels very to me it feels very tacked on.
Mm.
Um, the what's the other one? Ring Shout that came out a
Oh
few
yeah.
years later. Have you?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that one's like more sophisticated at doing it, right? Because like there's a whole like entire like other cosmology
Right.
that is like resisting the evil
Hmm.
in that. But then again, it's like these religious practices like were like actually like really like crucially important, right? And so like
Hmm.
reducing it to a kind of good versus evil struggle, I feel like
Hmm.
that's a disservice to the kind of like values native to those forms of believing and living and existing, right? So there's
Mm.
so there's this way that even like moving into narrative genres that we recognize, right? Even as a kind of preservation, right? There's a kind of undercutting of its reality,
Yeah.
or
Huh.
I don't reality is not the right word, but it's
Hmm.
kind of power to be taken seriously almost.
Well, one of the things that really struck me reading this time that hadn't jumped out at me a ton the first time, is just the father-son relationship here and the family relationship as this really, it's not like not a belabored point, but really bedrock, right? Like this whole story runs on this sort of background care, that this father and son have for each other, and then Black Tom's reaction, to his father being killed. And like jumping out at me so much that like, as you point out, that like Black Tom acquires this astonishing power in the service of Lovecraftian elder gods, but it's really just the razor blade his dad gives him that is the real tool. And something about that sort of like focus on the concreteness of the actual family relationship is this thread for it that really makes it work for me. And this is one of the things I
Mhm.
really liked about Ring Shout, which, and Clark is I think Ring Shout's a fantastic novella. Just it's a lot of fun, first off, but it's also
Mhm.
it's much more how to say it, much more openly supernatural, right? Like you
Yeah.
get a much bigger view of the weird horrors from beyond. Like they're fully on screen talking to you, right? But one of the things that's first off, I should say, like far too big for this episode of the podcast, but I mean a lot to go in there with both like Gullah history and with
Yeah.
Southern spirituality and how that ties into a lot of things. But one of the things that I think is really sophisticated about that novel is how Clark thinks about anger and violence, and not just as like a Star Wars style, don't be tempted by the dark side, right? But this idea that the quote unquote evil side in there is evil, but it's also that it holds out this idea that violence and hate are like the real other pole. It's not simply that the Lovecraftian evil there is just white racism. It's like white racism is a manifestation of this larger thing. But then it really grapples with and thinks about without tidying up how anger and violence are always part of that, but might sometimes still be justified and needed in this like, I don't know, pretty clever way that really kind of hung with
Yeah.
me after finishing that.
Yeah. I mean, the characters at the end of that are like faced with a choice, right? About managing their emotions, essentially, right? I
Hmm.
mean, like
Yeah.
what, how do you, and like even in the heat of this like battle, this like massive
Right.
battle at the foot of Stone Mountain.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, right. I mean, it gestures towards like, well, actually, like we have to sort of build a different kind of world, right?
Hmm.
Or that like the new dispensation like can't be founded in just a sort of like overthrowing of the sort of historical relations of the previous one, right?
Hmm.
And I find that interesting, like the end of that where like Lovecraft emerges, right, as this kind of cameo at the end of it.
Uh-huh.
It's not a total victory, right? It's just
Right.
it's actually it's a kind of provisional victory over the specific right set of circumstances caused by what Birth of a Nation, right?
Yeah, right.
And then they're like, oh, there's this like guy up in Providence who's right that
Uh-huh.
they've
Who
got their claws in.
should also say cameos here, right? Like he's like writing into the newspaper or something at the end of Black Tom,
Is
right?
he? I missed that.
There's like that minor little thing about like a guy from Rhode Island who's been living in Brooklyn writing in. Yeah.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. So maybe there is something interesting about Ring Shout being kind of local in that way. I mean,
Mm.
it's that this was also one that I read a while ago and then have reread and like found it much more rich. Like it was
Hmm.
very fun. I found it much more like challenging and kind of rich the second time.
Mm. Hmm.
So Tom, right, in this, the line that kind of it's not a line that gets crossed, but the thing that kind of sets him to fully reject the world as his father being killed,
Hmm.
staged as a like legitimate police shooting,
Right.
right? Because the detective, this private detective, goes into his apartment looking for this
It's like a page from a
I think
notebook, like a
the
mystical
page
notebook.
from the, yeah, this,
Yeah.
yeah. And so he shoots the father and takes the book, but then says that the father like picked up the guitar, which is where the page was hidden, and it looked like a rifle.
Hmm.
So this obvious kind of thing. That's like the last. That's the kind of like last connection that he
Hmm.
has, right? Like you were saying, like that, it's developed so well before that, like describing like walking slow, like how long it takes them to get to the like restaurant they're going to because his
Hmm.
father's arthritis, like the feelings that like Tommy has about like not laboring, right? Like
Hmm.
not doing the kind of physical labor that his
Right.
father did and his father's like body's been destroyed
Yeah.
by.
Right.
There's like a lot packed into
Hmm.
that relationship in a not a lot of pages, right?
Yeah.
And in a book that's mostly taking place outside of their apartment,
Hmm.
um, that that feels like really well established
Yeah.
as like I get why that breaks him. I get
Hmm.
why that breaks the character.
That little the little speech that his dad gives him when he gives him the knife, gives him the razor, which is like very like not melodramatic, but just this really deep felt expression of like it's dangerous out there. You're going someplace dangerous. Please come home. And just that
Right.
like and that like, his dad relates, a little story of himself having been in like these fraught situations before and just really perfectly encapsulate this really firm connection really, really easily. Yeah, this is really well done. We've been going for a bit. We should take a quick break and then come back and
Okay.
circle up a few of these loose ends. All right, we are back. We are still talking about Victor LaValle's Black Tom, the Ballad of Black Tom. We're also talking about approximately not an enormous number, but maybe a couple dozen other Lovecraft influenced retellings and reworkings, I should say. And so I think we want to talk about Lovecraft just a little bit more. We were talking about it during the break a little bit. Yeah, it's something I have thought about a lot because it is interesting to me that of all of the writers of his era, that the Lovecraft and the Lovecraft mythos are just one that are picked up and jumped on a lot by people, right? With different purposes and to different ends. And maybe some of it is just that it was kind of I hate to use this word, but kind of a franchise even then, right? It was something that was very collaborative and open to reinterpretation and multiple authors working on it, even during his lifetime. And there's something about it that kind of invites that reworking. But I think there's something else there too, and why we keep coming back to this, especially as knowing, as what Lovecraft is all about is sort of more and more the first thing you hear, right? When you first start learning about Lovecraft, you don't have to like I imagine, 30, 40 years ago, it would not have been the first thing you learned about Lovecraft, right? You would have had to find out for yourself the racism. You would have had to go read it. But now, like that's the primary thing most people
Yeah.
know, right? Off the cuff. But yeah, what's going on with
Yeah.
Lovecraft? Why is he still relevant? Why are we talking about him so much? What do we want to say about HPL?
I was going to say that like he's one of the kind of like cult brands, right? Like one of the first kind of like mass underground. There's so much work that went into recovering him from the sort of oblivion
Hmm.
of like right at the end of his career, right? And the really close circle of other writers
Hmm.
and fans who put a lot of work into that, right? Who then like built out the infrastructure of a lot of sci-fi publishing and
Yeah, right.
the kind of institutional part of it. So I think that that's probably part of it. It is interesting, like what you're saying, right? There's like the racism thing is like the what we lead with now.
Hmm.
I think that his racism is it's like a very particular kind of racism, right?
Mm.
The it comes from a kind of like class position, right? I mean, he's this kind of like disappointed elite or child of this like family that he imagined as having been sort of like in decline.
Mm.
sort of marked by madness. So he has a kind of like Gothic self-conception, right?
Hmm.
Is like
Oh yeah,
part of
totally.
his own sort of like self-mythologization. But the part that's interesting to me, and the part that is actually kind of recoverable about his work in a way, is the way that like a lot of the stuff that's racist is about like this kind of like horror at different bodies, and like there's that kind of like
Yeah, totally.
affective
Right.
immediate stuff. But then there's also this sense of like historical understanding that's behind a lot of that, right? In the sense that that like Western civilization is in decline, it's being replaced by a kind of backwards or primitive set of values. And I think for a while that wasn't necessarily like the mainstream like racist view in the United States.
Mm.
I think for a lot of the 20th century, there was a much more, or at least not mainstream racist view. That's a kind of useless phrase, but
Hmm.
the kind of racism that is in the popular imagination is much more about kind of like poor whites, right, being like ignorant and angry, right, in the South. That's the sort of like view of it that emerges in like the 40s and 50s and 60s and is sort
Mm.
of when we teach it, right? We teach, if you're like your like high school class, right? Like it's like Jim Crow is all of these like Southerners like yelling at, you know,
Yeah, right.
kids trying to integrate schools.
Yeah.
Lovecraft like has this kind of elite racism, this sense that like he's lost power. And I think that like that's the structure of a lot of kind of racist discourse now.
Right.
So there's something where he's much more interested in not like a kind of white supremacy that means that like white society can kind of like march into the future and like take over other planets or whatever. But it's right, that would be a kind of like a more kind of like utopian
Yeah,
fascist
right. Yeah, yeah. A
imaginary, right?
fascist
He
utopian
doesn't have
imaginary.
that,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's like it's horror for him, right?
Mm.
The
Hmm.
engagement with history is an engagement with a horror of your own, the kind of like what the like look on my works ye mighty in despair, right? That like, oh, we're
Right.
gonna get erased, like time is indifferent, but also that like the powerful can be overthrown.
Hmm.
And also I mean I think that he's like also kind of like scared of like evolution, right? The idea that
Yeah.
like
Right.
the Europeans like would have evolved from people who weren't white.
Hmm.
There's like a bit of that baked into it. So it's like a kind of like
Hmm.
historical, it's a racism that's like attuned to like the progress of history and the nature of like social change
Hmm.
that for him, I feel is isolating, but like is kind of our politics now. So it's worth like engaging with more
Mm.
directly, beyond just the like, wow, look at the slurs that he uses, because he
Right.
does use them.
Oh my
Um,
God. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Putting it that way, like, almost makes it this horror of matter, this horror of materialism, right? And like, whether it's the bodies that are quite like mine, or the fact that we're on this unstable rock hurling through the void, like those are like of the same order of horror and disgust for him. That
mhm,
sort of it makes the object of horror this sort of like much bigger thing, in like a kind of sad way, but also a kind of interesting way at the same time. I was thinking a lot
yeah,
when you were talking about always kind of picking up on some psychological things in
yeah,
Lovecraft, because so much of it just does feel kind of like, yeah, idiosyncrasy, which is not to say that it's not,
yeah,
like, I think like, we are right to, lambast his horrific racism, and it's easy to lambast his sometimes horrific prose. But there's also like, one of the things I think that has a little bit of lasting stuff with him is not his imagery, but like, sometimes his prose really works to express like this sort of like really troubled mind, right? And he feels afraid and scared, and in a lot of his writing, in this way that does work. I mean, it's kind of gothic, but it's
yeah.
sort of like overwrought. There's that do you know that Mountain Goats song, Lovecraft in Brooklyn? It's not Lovecraft speaking in the song. It's about someone feeling like Lovecraft felt in Brooklyn, which is just this like feeling of complete alienation and horrors everywhere and unknowable things all around you, and not getting anything, and just feeling, yeah, kind of scared for your life, in this sort of cosmic way.
Rhode Island drops into the ocean. No place to call home anymore. Lovecraft in
Yeah, it's rough, but it does. There is something there to come back to.
Mhm.
We wanted to. I was attempting to segue that into climate change, and I don't remember how I was going to do it,
Yeah.
but
The thing that to me like ties the kind of body stuff to the the sort of environment stuff or the sort of like cosmos stuff is when he is trying to actually narrate like the deep history. So when I was rereading At the Mountains of Madness, and he does this, and this is something in my other like my kind of like scholarly work. There's always these moments where authors kind of like give the game away and they're like,
mm,
fine, like here's the backstory, right? It's oftentimes like later in their careers, they'll just sort of like Faulkner does this a couple times, and I've like so like he'll just be like, fine, here's like 70 pages of like answering like all these questions that like
mm,
people have, right?
hmm
And there's something in that. I mean, I find really funny, right? That they're
hmm
just like fine, or like even for themselves, like to keep it all straight, they have to kind of like get it out
yeah,
on the page. The Shoggoths are the sort of like horrific monster that they discover in Antarctica, but they're basically the slaves of the old ones, and so like the narrator finds himself at first totally disturbed by the kind of grotesque body,
hmm
right, of the specimens they find.
hmm
But then at the end, he's like, "Wow, I really respect them. They had a great
right,
civilization. They survived like all of these different like intergalactic or like battles with like these other forces.
hmm
They also survived climate change. Like they're on Earth so long that like the oceans like rise and change a bunch. But
hmm
the thing that's like horrific for him is that like ultimately the sort of like hyperplastic, malleable slave species that they created becomes too like them. Like over time, it
hmm
assimilates their values and like becomes deliberative basically and decides to overthrow them
hmm
and then kills them and then apparently like lives under Antarctica and like eats penguins, which he's also
Also horrified
very,
of.
very afraid of. He talks about this like grotesque penguin several times.
hmm
So there's right there is that right there is that kind of like problematic or not problem. There's this like racist association of like the subordinated group with nature, right? Because like
hmm
they sort of turn from being a kind of natural resource into being deliberative subjects,
hmm
which I think is the interesting part about Tommy kicking off climate change in this is that
mm,
it sort of turns that on its head, right? And I just think like thinks about climate change as like a kind of like outcome of the excesses of
right.
modernity. I mean,
hmm
sort of broadly, because it's not they're not like smog or anything in this book that's like
hmm
producing it. So there's no like mechanism for it, right?
right.
That's like a really big hammer for a kind of small nail, right?
hmm
If that image makes sense, right? That understanding climate change almost as like a passive form of revenge or something, right?
hmm
I mean, to put it sort of bluntly, like the people who are going to be like most affected by climate change are like not, it's not like
right.
Malone
Right.
and the racist like Brooklynites or whatever, right?
Yeah,
It's
right.
it's so there like that gesture. I get it as a kind of inversion of what Lovecraft is doing, but it also like the payoff of it as a kind of thing that grounds it in the present is a little disturbing almost.
hmm
It feels out of place, I think, for a very short novella with like a lot of like really intentional choices
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
about how things kind of pay out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was mentioning I don't know where to go with this, but one of the things I was thinking about with reading with this is just kind of holding it in my head alongside other speculative fiction that is thinking about violence and specifically like retributive violence, thinking about violence as a justified response to oppression. A couple books in the last couple years, I'm thinking of Chandrasekhar's The Saint of Bright Doors, which is very centrally about this question, and R.F. Kuang's Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, which is an alternate, right, speculative history, which is thinking about a magic powered British Empire and people revolting against it. Black Tom becoming this incredibly potent character and really not clear what he's doing with it. And I mean, I think part of it is just that Laval is setting out to some extent to keep this story within the bounds of an original, not very good story, right? That's I think, and
Yeah,
I think that's part of it, right? That like Laval wants this to be a story that, to some extent, comports with doesn't contradict the shape of the original, right? That you can just put this in there.
Yeah.
So that's maybe part of it. But I don't know. There's just something about how there are these moments when Black Tom, you get a sense of how powerful he is. And, even just in the second half when we're getting the perspective of Malone, the white cop, who is very funny in Lovecraft's original, just his use of even like
Yeah.
trying to recover this like Celtic mystic racist
Yeah.
thing as like, I'm like, what are you
Yeah.
doing, man?
Well, it's right. It's straight out of the kind of like provisional whiteness of the Irish,
Yeah.
right? Where he's kind of like between two worlds because he's
Uh-huh.
Irish.
Yes. Uh-huh. And still has like, magical insight.
Yeah.
But in Laval, when Malone sees Black Tom at the end, it's such a potent little tiny detail that just Black Tom looking him in the eye and the way he's standing, Malone seeing like, oh, this is a different person who is not terrified of me. If earlier we've seen Black
Yeah.
Tom very consciously think about how I present myself in different environments. But we get this moment of Black Tom and realizing that like not only is he physically unafraid now of these armed police who are coming after him, but that he has somehow surpassed in mystic power his supposed boss. Is it Shoidam? Soidam? I'm not sure how to say that. Just kind of like we have this brief bit of physical violence and then just ends with this kind of like climate change, pin at the end without much sense of what else he could have done with that power or what he was doing with it. And it's
Yeah.
very strange. I don't know what to do with that, but it just lingers for me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, especially because the choice that he makes, right, is indifference over
Cruelty
malice, right?
or
That
malice. Yeah.
cruelty,
Uh-huh.
right? Or I don't
Yeah.
remember exactly. It might have been
I
cruelty.
think I wrote it down. Yeah. He says what was indifference compared to malice. So this sort of like embracing of the elder ones, Cthulhu, whoever, who will
Right.
wash all of humanity away with rising CO2 levels, as that level of indifference being preferable to the racism and
Right.
the very targeted violence that the Black Times experience, which is interesting
Right.
and potent, but as you bring up, also a weird response.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Because it's not, well, maybe I was going to say it's not like collective, right? But we don't
Mm,
know what's on the other side there. So it
yeah.
might be, right?
Huh.
There might be some others there, right?
Yeah. All right, this is good. I think we're getting
Okay.
kind of towards the end here. This has been good. It was really nice to revisit this novella and just think of it in context. I think we could have talked a lot more about the boomlet and more of this, but
Yeah.
there's other conversations happening out there. So,
Yeah.
what else? Do you want to share anything that you're working on, or where people can find your stuff, or anything you want to leave people with?
Yeah. So I'm on Twitter if people want to follow me there.
Hmm.
And I've got two articles coming out in the next, I don't know, 4 to 6 months, depending on the timelines of academic publishing. But that both kind of like deal with these questions of like history and speculative stuff and race. So I've got an article coming out on Pauline Hopkins' novel Of One Blood.
Mm.
It's like 1903 kind of speculative novel that kind of make the argument that she's actually sort of like sincere in her
Mm.
in her deployment of these kind of pseudoscientific, like these sort of religious spiritual precepts that get described as being sort of speculative. I kind
Okay.
of argue they're not. So that's one, and then I've got an article coming out at some point soon on actually on Vandermeer on Southern Reach,
Okay. Cool.
and the kind of like weird status of race and identity
Mm.
in the novels, and then and how how sort of those were marketed, and how he kind of talked about like the recuperative work of representation within speculative publishing,
Mm.
by having like a kind of non-homogeneous white cast, but then kind of looking at the ways that like actually race is deployed within
Okay.
the narratives and within the kind of the ideas that are going on with it about
Cool.
bodies and stuff. So
Yeah.
yeah, those will
Oh,
be
that's
out.
excellent.
I will tweet about them.
Nice. Of One Blood, that's one of the ones that the is it MIT Press is just republishing? Is that
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's more
Yes.
available to people again. Cool.
Yeah. There's two or three actually new editions of that just came out in the last couple of years. So
Okay. Nice.
it's good.
Awesome.
It's worth reading. It's very
Okay.
cool.
Cool.
All right.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really good. It's been a nice
Yeah.
conversation. And yeah, have a great one.
Thanks, you too.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism, with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Bartrahari. translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabrielle Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. This episode also featured a brief clip from the Mountain Goats song Lovecraft in Brooklyn off their album Heretic Pride from 4AD. Check that out. It is fairly high on my Mountain Goats album power ranking. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, that is rad. A few different ways you can do that. Subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/ancillary review. That would be super cool of you. We really want to get the ARB to a point where we can pay our contributors. Check out our show notes for bookshop links. If you buy a book through there, we get a cut. The internet, as you know, is a dying hellscape, stalked by mindless algorithms. Do your part to resist, or at least be a little more mindful. Click like, click share, leave a comment or review wherever you find us. Tell someone you know to check us out. It really helps. Questions, suggestions, pedantic notes about things we got wrong? Drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com. Next time, John Greenaway, the lit crit guy himself, wreathed in terrible majesty, is coming to A Meal of Thorns to talk about Sarah Perry's Melmoth, what the Gothic is all about, and how the sins of the past are still with us. Cheery stuff. Until then, read it like you stole it.
Well, that could get us to I think that could get us back to the kind of climate change bit.
Yeah, invite Haraway into the room for a
Because
minute.
it's
Yeah.